it time to add witness tamper-in-chief to his title? Donald Trump's harassment of the family members of Michael Cohen, his former personal attorney and fixer, prompting Cohen to postpone public testimony planned for February 7th. Cohen's attorney, Lanny Davis, announcing in a statement today that the delay is, quote, due to ongoing threats against his family from President Trump and his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. The president's attacks against Michael Cohen and his family have come in the now typical Trumpian form, via tweets to his millions of viewers like this one. Quote, lying to reduce his jail time, watch father-in-law, and this recent diatribe on Fox News.
And in order to get a sentence reduced, he says, I have an idea. I'll give you some information on the president. Well, there is no information, but he should give information maybe on his father-in-law, because that's the one that people want to look at, because where does that money? That's the money in the family. And I guess he didn't want to talk about his father-in-law. He's trying to get his sentence reduced. So it's pretty sad. It's weak, and it's very sad to watch a thing like that. I couldn't care less.
What is his father-in-law's name?
I don't know, but you'll find out and you'll look into it, because nobody knows what's going on over there.
Why does the president fear Cohen's testimony so much that he's targeting Cohen's family? Maybe because Cohen implicated the president in a hush money scheme involving porn stars and has pleaded guilty to lying about Trump's business ties to Russia. It has always been the case that the cases around Cohen that Trump's allies fear most for the president legally. And unlike the near daily efforts by Rudy Giuliani to confuse the facts around the Mueller probe, the hush money case, the campaign finance allegations about the president, they're clear, they're public, and they're easy to understand. But despite all that evidence, President Trump this afternoon denied threatening Cohen at all.
I would say he's been threatened by the truth. He's only been threatened by the truth, and he doesn't want to do that probably from me or other of his clients. He has other clients also, I assume, and he doesn't want to tell the truth from me or other of his clients.
Said the president, who's now lied more than 8,000 times. The chairman of the House Intel and Oversight Committees stressing their sympathy for Cohen and his family in a statement out just this afternoon. Quote, we understand that Mr. Cohen's wife and other family members fear for their safety after these attacks, and we have repeatedly offered our assistance to work with law enforcement to enhance security measures for Mr. Cohen and his family. Nevertheless, not appearing before Congress was never an option. We expect Mr. Cohen to appear before both committees, and we remain engaged with his counsel about his upcoming appearances. The drama over Cohen's testimony colliding with a new development in Paul Manafort's case, his lawyers insisting in a new court filing that he didn't knowingly lie to investigators. We're reading through that heavily redacted document. We'll bring you anything we learn in the coming minutes. Here to discuss the latest dramatic developments, some of our favorite reporters and friends. Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the AP. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance is at the table. We're happy about that. Karine Jean-Pierre, a senior advisor with MoveOn.org. And Donnie Deutsch is back. Matt Miller, Justice and Security Analyst for MSNBC, former chief spokesman for the Justice Department, joins us from Washington. Let me start with you. Is Cohen legitimately afraid for his safety and that of his family?
I'll give it to you in real time because I had a front row seat. I happened to be speaking to Michael right after the Pure interview. He said, I'm not doing it. What do you mean I'm not doing it? I'm not testifying. My wife is sitting here crying. They're calling out my poor father-in-law. He's 80, so this is a man who's never done anything. By the way, he watches his wife cry every day. He goes, I'm not doing it. So I literally saw the obstruction of justice in real time. And I remember he even said to him, I said, well, Michael, if I was innocent and he's insulated now because he brought it out. He goes, he's the president of the United States. The Justice Department report, he can do whatever he wants. So that's where it started. There are other threats that are happening also that happen every day that have magnified 1,000-fold. The things that he gets written to about his daughter that are so heinous, just since he started to talk about testifying in Congress. So he volunteered in the first place. I actually wasn't quite sure what he was doing. He volunteered to do this. He was not asked, and he was anxious to do it because he does have a story to tell. What the American public can kind of take solace in, they might not get the Perry Mason moment, but he has given 70 hours to Mueller. He has spoken already to the Senate. There's nothing new he's going to say that he can say. And the other reason he pulled out, and it was in that announcement, he is still cooperating. There are ongoing things. So as a cooperating, ongoing person, I don't think it's even an intelligent legal move, and I think his lawyers finally got to that point. So for all of the above, and that is why you saw the statement that Schiff and Cummings put out, they got canceled on, and they were not what's going on. They got it. And, you know, we have to step back and take politics out of it. You know, the president just did a Freddie Pantangelo Godfather, you know, when they bring him into the thing and your brother's sitting right there. And out of all the heinous things he's done, to me, this is a new level. And I saw it on a very personal level.
Well, let me just press you then on some of what you've dangled out there for us. Is the tweeting all, or has the president or his associates, have they done the sorts of things that Michael Cohen used to do to reporters and other people? Have they harassed him privately?
I'm not aware of that. I'm telling you what I'm aware of and the things that he's talked to me about, and he's despondent about his family. You know, I think most people were in this kind of trouble in general, or I think most people who are at their core are decent. Their family is what kills them, you know, and seeing this is happening to his family, I think this really put him over the edge. We're so numbed and anesthetized at this point. The president got on the air and tweeted publicly, "Watch out, father-in-law." Now, I don't know if that's obstruction of justice. I certainly know it was obstructing what he was planning to do.
Did he try to tamper, though, with a witness? I mean, was there contact from the president or his associates before Cohen cooperated?
I'm not aware of that.
Do you know what the ongoing cooperation looks like?
I do not know, but I know it's ongoing, and I think his counsel said to him, you know, I think Mueller had already said, look, you can do it, but you can't touch anything in the investigation, because I think Mueller was very sensitive to standing in front of Congress and saying no. So I think as far as where else he's cooperating, I think there are ongoing things, and these things are continuing to evolve. So I don't think it made sense to him. And I know he's anxious to do it. His instinct why he wanted to do it. If you've watched Michael Cohen, he's one of those guys like and gets himself in trouble. But he almost wants to puke it out of him. I mean, he's been. But
if he wants to come puke it out at our table, we'll host him.
I know that's going to be a bite. He doesn't really want to puke it out. He wants to tell his story.
I know. Look, honestly, for all the dirty things he did, out of what he's now acknowledged was stupid, blind loyalty to Donald Trump, I can imagine he feels like he wants to puke it out. But just, you know, at a serious level, if this is witness tampering, which, you know, all of the danger of non-lawyers covering stories like this, we Googled witness tampering. It sure sounds a lot like what we found. Are there additional legal recourses for him?
I'm not. You'd have to ask the counselor over here. But it was very interesting when I was telling my story in the green room to Glenn Kirshner last week. He said, "I would call you as a witness in a case like this." I said, "Well, no thanks." I got but I mean,
Johnny, I mean, look. I mean, let's be serious here. You have sort of been through this with him as his friend. I would be surprised if they didn't want to, because people don't always remember. I'm sure this has been traumatic. He did bad things. No, but I'm just saying. I mean, you're talking about how he feels about the president threatening him. I mean, he is imagine a pretty important witness in both the Mueller probe and the SDNY case.
And you know, when it's not your own family, because I remember going, "Come on, Michael, you're overreacting." And he says, "Well, how about if it was your father-in-law?"
Right, or your wife. I mean, the president has also targeted his wife.
And you know, the thousands, I'm not saying the president is responsible for this, but, you know, the president has set a tone in this country of the most disgusting, vile things that come at his children, particularly his daughter, that is almost unconscionable.
Joyce.
So witness tampering is serious. Prosecutors take these situations with an incredible amount of seriousness, because what it does when someone tries to intimidate a witness to keep them from testifying is it keeps prosecutors from getting to the truth of the matter. There is a crime here. Your Googling worked well. It's 18 U.S. Code 1512.
Let me put it up. I took the fruits of my Google search. Here it is. This is tampering with a witness. Whoever knowingly uses intimidation, threatens, or corruptly persuades another person or attempts to do so with intent to influence, delay, or prevent the testimony of any person in an official proceeding, or cause or induce any person to withhold testimony, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both.
So that's exactly it. Using intimidation, or even attempting to use intimidation, not just to keep somebody from testifying, but even to delay them, could constitute the crime of witness tampering. Of course, we know that the president can't be prosecuted for this crime, and so he may feel like he has a safe harbor there. Ultimately, how it might play on the Hill, I guess, is an entirely different question. But to take a step back from who can and can't be prosecuted, this is the president of the United States who would be a target of this investigation, but for his status as president, this is that target trying to keep a witness from testifying by threatening his family.
Matt Miller, this also has some echoes. I mean, ultimately, in the articles of impeachment for Bill Clinton, a lot of this conduct fell under obstruction of justice. There were, I believe, allegations of telling witnesses what to do or not do in front of the grand jury. This seems like something that, if it came to that juncture, could very well appear in an article of impeachment.
Yeah, I agree with that. Look, I think Joyce kind of hit the nail on the head. The president has been, to some extent, acting with impunity throughout this investigation in trying to tamper witnesses and praising witnesses who don't cooperate and criticizing witnesses who don't cooperate. Kind of, acting like a mob boss throughout, attacking the FBI for flipping people. Basically always taking the sides of lawbreakers over law enforcement agents. And I think the reason he acts with impunity is because he knows very well the Justice Department's opinion that he can't be indicted, and so he thinks that he can act with no consequences. But there ought to be some sanction for this action. Whether I think Donnie's account of Cohen's thinking was very compelling. I suspect also, as he said, that he decided ultimately there wasn't much for him to gain in this hearing, since he couldn't talk about the two investigations with which he's cooperating. He was just going to sit there and get beaten up by Republicans. And so this was a good reason to pull out. But the president shouldn't be able to escape this without a sanction. And so if there's no criminal sanction, if there can't be any criminal sanction, that means it has to be a political sanction. And so if there ever is some kind of reckoning where the political environment changes sufficiently enough that Democrats feel they can move impeachment articles against him and hope for and feel confident of a conviction in the Senate, this absolutely would have to be in the bill of particulars.
All right, let me put up some of what Matt Miller just talked about. This is an illustration of what he just said of praising people that he thought were not cooperating and attacking those who are. The president tweeted this: "I feel very badly for Paul Manafort and his wonderful family. Justice took a 12-year-old tax case, among other things, applied tremendous pressure on him, and unlike Michael Cohen, he refused to make up stories in order to get a deal. Such respect for a brave man." Now, Paul Manafort tried to flip on the president. He just was such a pathological liar, he couldn't keep his commitments to Mueller. So that he doesn't even really have this praise for Manafort quite right.
Right, he had his deal taken away from him. But I think you're also such a keen insight into how the president views the world and views people around him. We know about his sense of loyalty. For him, it's obviously just a one-way street. He demands loyalty. He gives very little back. But I believe it was former FBI Director Comey who compared him to a mob boss.
Oh, I have that. Hang on, let's watch, and then we'll come right back to you.
You said as this was happening, you had a flashback to your early days as a prosecutor.
I had a flashback to my days investigating the mafia, La Cosa Nostra. I felt this effort to make us all, and maybe this wasn't their intention, but it's the way it felt to me, to make us all Amica Nostra. We're all part of the messaging. We're all part of the effort. The boss is at the head of the table, and we're going to figure out together how to do this.
How strange is it for you to sit here and compare the president to a mob boss?
Very strange. And I don't do it lightly. And I'm not trying to, by the way, suggest that President Trump is out breaking legs and shaking down shopkeepers. But instead, what I'm talking about is that leadership culture constantly comes back to me when I think about my experience with the Trump administration.
That's exactly right. That's how he ran the Trump organization. And at that point, Michael Cohen was very much part of that sort of mob-like mentality. He was the leg breaker. And, he is run the administration the same way. We know his anger at Jeff Sessions was because he felt like Sessions didn't have his back. Sessions betrayed him by recusing himself from the Russia report. Exactly right, by following the law, by choosing the law over loyalty to the president. So we're seeing that here with the Cohen situation, too. Now, I think Cohen is going to be compelled to testify. I mean, Cummings' statement made pretty clear, testifying before Congress is not an option. Maybe it's going to get delayed, but he's going to be made to do this at some point. Now, we know that Mueller has suggested that there'll be walls over the Russia stuff. So, yes, in that regard, maybe there wouldn't be much new in terms of that investigation. But what the White House is concerned about is that this is going to be a human face. And it's Michael Cohen, who, has some credibility issues, no doubt. But there's going to be a human face there who's going to tell in vivid detail conversations he had with the president. And there's something different about reading it on a paper, hearing it in a court document, discussing it on a show like this, and having someone there in front of Congress talk about the president of the United States instructing him to break the law. So
Matt Miller, I'm reminded of Rudy Giuliani on Sunday saying, "I've seen the tapes," or on Monday. It was either the cleanup or it was the New Yorker. It was the cleanup of the walk back, I think. I think it was a quote in the New Yorker, and the reporter said, "You've seen tapes?" You said, "Oh, I shouldn't have said that." So the idea that Michael Cohen doesn't represent an ongoing legal and political threat is too weak of a word. Terror to this president would be false. The president responding to the raid on Cohen's apartment and offices by calling it an attack on the nation. This, in the middle of the shutdown, talking about how Cohen's afraid of the truth. All Cohen has now is the truth. The only way to spend less time in jail, the only way to protect his family, is to tell the truth.
You know, a lot of people didn't know what Rudy Giuliani was talking about when he referred to tapes, but I think the illusion you're making is right. I suspect what he was referring to was the evidence that was seized from Michael Cohen's office by the FBI, a great deal of which was turned over to Giuliani and Trump's legal team as part of their attempt to sift out what was privileged and what was not. So I suspect Rudy Giuliani has gone and listened to some of the tapes that Michael Cohen made of the president. There are probably other tapes that he doesn't have any idea, because they didn't go into this privilege fight. He has no idea what's on them. So that, Michael Cohen is, having been with the president for 12 years through all of his real estate deals here, abroad, all over the place, being his fixer, is sitting on evidence about the president. And by the way, some of the evidence almost certainly relates to criminal behavior by the president. We've seen him testify to that in court in the Southern District of New York. But he's probably got evidence about other things that may not rise to the standard of criminality, but would be grossly inappropriate behavior for someone holding the highest office in the land. And for him to come testify to that publicly, I think represents a grave threat to the president. And that's why you've seen him, and that's why you've seen his attorney act the way they have over the past few weeks.
So, Karine, we don't know what, if any, crimes Robert Mueller has unearthed around collusion or obstruction, but we do know the crimes that have been alleged against the president in the Southern District of New York. Michael Cohen implicated the president in August hearing. On or about October of 2016, in coordination with and at the direction of Trump, I arranged to make a payment to a second individual with information that would be harmful to the candidate and to the campaign to keep the individual from disclosing the information. That is a crime he has been accused of. The government has sponsored that allegation in their sentencing document for Cohen. Before he heads to jail, which is what, March?
March 5th, I think.
And we think he'll talk in some form before he goes to jail?
He wants to. I know he certainly wants to, and I don't know what Congress is planning on doing.
And as you said, Congress plans to compel him to. Just detailing how individual one committed a crime, the crime of campaign finance violation, not just paying someone inappropriately or illegally, but in a way that may have affected the outcome of the election, seems like a pretty big deal.
It is a huge deal, but it reminds me, when you were reading that, it reminds me back in April, right, when the FBI raided Cohen's office, Cohen's home, and the reaction we got from the president of the United States, which was what the FBI did was an attack on this nation. And now, months later, we know exactly why he feels this way. But we talk about Donald Trump, the president of the United States, being a mobster, threatening people, witnesses, like as we've seen with Cohen. But that's it's everything that Donald Trump does. Everything that he does has this flavor of authoritarian, tint on it. It is with him holding 800,000 hostages, the federal workers for his wall, and knowing that he said Mexico was going to pay for it. And now it's this attack on Michael Cohen's family. And he does it just blatantly out there for all of us to see. This is the president of the United States, and he needs to be held accountable. And I believe Democrats will do that.
On a personal note, politics is pretty nasty, and we all go at Trump and comes with people, but families are off base. I mean, you just leave families out of it.
But he does it all the time. It's not the first time. Ted Cruz's family he went after during.
I want to go back to what Matt said. Forget even the legal stuff. How about when he's asked the question, have you ever heard the president say anything racially defamatory? Can you repeat those things? And it's been written about, but hear him come out. And so everything, to Matt's point, 10 years by this guy's side. And the last I looked, other than staying away from the Mueller investigation, any of those congressmen can go anywhere they want. And so I know those stories need to be told and will be told. I know he wants to, and I'm sure they'll reschedule, and we'll go from there.
Just if you had to make a prediction, do you think we will see his face and hear him tell the stories you're talking about before he reports?
I know he wants to. I know he wants to.
All right.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.